Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. As is my usual procedure, I put together my radio program about a week before it airs. I have to do this because the Christian radio stations like to have the audio way in advance. They're not like the larger studios, the bigger stations that are set up to do live programming. Now, the YouTubes usually are done in conjunction with the same topic as the radio program. I tend to film those a day before the radio program airs. So I have a few days after recording the radio program to think further about the topic, and that's why the YouTubes tend to be more complete than the radio programs. But this delay creates a little bit of a problem. The delay between the radio program and the YouTube, because we are living in a day when the lead stories change constantly. The big headlines today are forgotten about tomorrow, and this is a major social problem because nothing gets fixed. There's information overload. Everybody just throws up their hands. Now, if I were broadcasting just my morning messages, my sermons, there wouldn't be a relevance problem because the nice thing about theology is that it doesn't change. But in that I'm doing some commentary in the news, it has a very short shelf life. So last week I recorded a radio program about the Inspector General 500-page report on James Comey's handling of the Hillary Clinton case. Now, since then, the headlines in the news has shifted. First, an entire week where the media pushed the story of the children of illegal immigrants being separated from their parents in detention. Then Trump signed an executive order. It didn't do a whole lot, but it took the wind out of the media's sails. Then the story switched to the Democrats personally harassing individuals in the Trump administration. And probably in about 5 minutes, a new crisis and a new story is going to arise. So the AG story has already been forgotten, but I still want to cover the story because this report from the Attorney General gives us some important spiritual lessons. The reason the story is actually dead is because it made the Democrats look bad. The Democrats were saying that there was no political bias in the FBI or in other departments under the Obama administration. And yet we discover in this new report that FBI agents were political operatives for the Democratic Party. And for political purposes, they did not prosecute Hillary Clinton, and they opened the Russian investigation to take down the Trump campaign. So, of course, the left-leaning news media is not going to be discussing this story. And you can be sure if that story hurt the Republicans, the media would keep that story alive for quite a few weeks. And in fact, I believe one of the reasons we're not hearing much about the Russian investigation is because there is nothing to be found there to indict the Republicans. And the more the investigation is pushed, it appears that it's digging up more dirt on the Democrats. It's exposing Democratic corruption. So here is the timeless lesson I want us to see from the AG report. The law of unintended consequences. James Comey and FBI agent Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, by trying to hurt Trump, actually hurt Hillary Clinton. They unintentionally and unwittingly effectively destroyed Hillary's chance to be president. And this is a principle we see quite often in the Bible. Psalm chapter 21, verse 11. Though they intend evil against you and devise a plot, they will not succeed. For you will make them turn their back. You will aim your bow at their face. Or Psalm 9:15, the nations have sunk down into the pit which they have made. In the net which they hid, their own foot has been caught. Now, it's not so much that Donald Trump is a righteous man, so that everything done against him is reversed. But the point is that those who plot evil, that evil come back on their own heads. And an additional lesson here is that no matter how much you try, you can never thwart the will of God. Isaiah chapter 46, verse 10, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times things which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure. So in context, what is God's good pleasure? To raise up King Nebuchadnezzar over Babylon to conquer Judah. Verse 11, calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my purpose from a far country. That's a reference to either Nebuchadnezzar or King Cyrus. Truly I have spoken, truly I will bring it to pass. I have planned it, surely I will do it. Now Nebuchadnezzar was no saint, but God raised him up to fulfill his purposes, and woe be to those who did not submit to the yoke of Babylon. Jeremiah 27. And Daniel and his 3 friends became Nebuchadnezzar's closest counselors because they submitted to his authority. You can't win against God. If you try, God will always turn it around so that you actually help his cause and you hurt yourself. So here's the story. Back in April, Congress requested the DOJ, the Department of Justice, under Jeff Sessions, to investigate if there were any illegal political partisanship going on at the FBI in regard to James Comey not prosecuting Hillary for violating the law in regard to having a private server in her home. Remember, Hillary had installed this private server to conduct governmental and political business. This was not simply having a private email account. This was a piece of equipment that cost thousands of dollars and cost thousands of dollars a month to have a professional maintain it. So the only reason Hillary or anyone would do something like this is to prevent someone in the government from looking into what she was doing, so that she could destroy any data if anyone was requesting that data. And that's exactly what Hillary did. She destroyed all the data on the server after being subpoenaed by the government to disclose the government business that she was conducting on the server. So the crime is really twofold. First, having a server to deliberately break the law in regard to handling government information. Second, the very thing that she was trying to hide. Most people suspect it has something to do with donations to the Clinton Foundation for political favors. No one has a private server in their basement unless they're trying to hide something. So in July of 2016, James Comey, then the head of the FBI, comes out to say that Hillary was negligent, but she did nothing illegal. And Comey had to reinterpret the law concerning the handling of classified information to exonerate Hillary. Comey said that the law doesn't apply to Hillary because she didn't intend to break the law, but the law clearly states that her activity was illegal regardless of intent. So our current DOJ investigated this whole matter, and in short, their conclusion was that agents at the FBI were politically motivated to help Hillary and to stop Donald Trump. FBI agent Peter Strzok, investigator in the Hillary investigation and in the Russian investigation, texted another FBI agent, Lisa Page, with whom he was having an affair. Page asks, Trump is not ever going to become president? And Strzok responds, no, he won't. We will stop it. The report states, the text potentially indicates or creates the appearance that investigator decisions were impacted by bias or improper considerations. It is not only indicative of a biased state of mind, but even more seriously, implies a willingness to take official action to impact the presidential candidate's electoral prospects. This is antithetical to the core values of the FBI and the Department of Justice, The report also goes on to state that there were at least 5 other separate agents at the FBI who sent pro-Clinton and anti-Trump text messages. Congress is asking for their names. You see, government agencies are supposed to be neutral. Political parties are not supposed to use government agencies, especially law enforcement agencies, to target their opponents. This is what happens in the Soviet Union, not in the United States. So here's the timetable. The DOJ report was that in the spring of 2016, Comey had already made up his mind that Hillary was not going to be prosecuted by the FBI for her email server, even before Hillary was interviewed. Then in June came the famous tarmac meeting between the former Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, and Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton invited Loretta Lynch onto his plane for a private meeting, which looked bad because Lynch was supposed to be investigating Hillary. Was Bill Clinton trying to influence Lynch? But by this meeting, Bill Clinton set up a series of events that would actually sabotage the Hillary campaign. So the FBI investigates, and in July, James Comey would make a public announcement that the FBI would not prosecute Hillary. The AG report points out that Comey's first draft was changed to favor Hillary. The announcement removed the statement that President Obama was contacting Hillary on her private account. The statement that Hillary was grossly negligent was changed to extremely careless, and that Hillary's server was reasonably likely hacked by hostile actors to possibly hacked. Now, the reason Comey made this announcement, in his mind, Lynch and the Department of Justice looked compromised after that meeting on the tarmac. But by Comey making this announcement, he was actually breaking protocol. To quote the report, Comey determined that he should make an independent announcement in order to protect a sense of justice more broadly in the country, that things are fair and not fixed and done independently. Comey acknowledged that he made a conscious decision not to tell department leadership about his plans to make a separate statement from the DOJ because he was concerned they would instruct him not to do so. And so Comey was afraid that the DOJ would say, no, this is our job. The AG report goes on. We determined that Comey's decision to make this statement was the result of his belief that only he had the ability to credibly and authoritatively convey the rationale for the decision not to seek charges against Clinton, and that he needed to hold the press conference to protect the FBI and the DOJ from the extraordinary harm that he believed would have resulted if he failed to do so. So in short, Comey was trying to put an end to all of the accusations that Hillary should be prosecuted. But by doing this, by changing the law to accommodate to her, he actually made matters worse. And by Bill Clinton meeting with Loretta Lynch on the tarmac, and by James Comey exonerating Hillary, guess what it did? It brought more public attention to Hillary's actions. You know, whenever an official makes an excuse for someone not being guilty, what do you think? Well, they must be guilty. Well, the whole thing kept Hillary's email server issue in the news. And then came the revelations that Congressman Anthony Weiner, his laptop contained some emails from Hillary. This was discovered in September of 2016. The FBI did nothing with this until about a month later. But then James Comey, right before the election, announced to Congress that some of Hillary's emails that had been erased on her server had been found, and that he was again going to open the investigation. And this looked bad for Hillary politically, that she again was being investigated by the FBI. After the blowback politically, a few days before the election, James Comey comes out and he says, well, there's nothing in those emails. Hillary is no longer under investigation, but the political damage was done. Remember, the election was very close. Hillary actually won the popular vote. A few more thousand votes for Hillary in some key states would have given her the presidency. So why did Comey open up the investigation right before the election? Because he was sure that Hillary would win, and for some strange, bizarre reason, he thought he was helping out her legitimacy. From the report, we found that Comey's decision was the result of several interrelated factors that were connected to his concern that failing to send the letter about these new email discoveries to Congress, it would harm the FBI and his ability to lead it, and his view that candidate Clinton was going to win the presidency, and she would be perceived to be an illegitimate president if the public first learned of the information after the election. Well, whether Comey was right or wrong in this is beside the point. The point is that he unwittingly, in trying to help her, dynamited her campaign. The Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer said about the AG report, quote, "It was Trump who benefited from all of these mistakes, so it hardly reflects deep state or a bias against him." Well, that's an upside-down way of looking at the report. It was obvious that there was political bias toward Clinton, but the point is that it backfired. Now, are you still following me on all this? This stuff can get very complicated, very convoluted. Oh, what tangled web we weave when we practice to deceive. And the same tangled web is found in various biblical descriptions of God's providence, such as the circumstances that worked themselves out for Joseph to be the head of Egypt, or the circumstances that caused David to become the king, or how Israel was split into two countries, or how Daniel came to the place of power. The Bible always emphasizes how God causes evil plotting to be reversed, and God causes little things to turn major events in unexpected directions. I love this one text on the providence of God. 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 34. "Now a certain man drew his bow at random and struck the king of Israel in the joint of the armor. So he said to the driver of his chariot, 'Turn around and take me out of the fight, for I am severely wounded.' So it just so happened at the exact moment, an unnamed soldier happened to shoot an arrow, pulling it with just the right force, the wind being in just the right direction, the king of Israel being in just the right position, and the arrow hits a kink in his armor. There are no accidents. Every little circumstance is under the control of God, because you cannot thwart the will of God. Isaiah chapter 8, verse 10. "Devise a plan, it will be thwarted. State a proposal, but it will not stand, for God is with us." So why even discuss this AG report? Because it's just another reminder that in the end, you cannot beat God or his people. And this is both a comfort for the people of the Lord, that nobody can do anything against us that will thwart God's will for our life. But this is also a terror for the ungodly, that everything that they try to do to stop the work of God will be undone. They will actually further his work. They will actually further his glory, and they will further their own judgment. Even when evil people win legislation, they lose. When Satan plotted to put Jesus on the cross, Satan was actually doing the will of God. And he was unwittingly bringing about his own legal defeat. Acts chapter 4, verse 27. "For truly in this city they were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. All of those individuals, though they were evil individuals, worked for the will of God. Now, the apostles made this statement in Acts chapter 4 after they were arrested for preaching the gospel. And they were acknowledging the fact that even the evil actions of the wicked are thwarted by God. Even the arrest of the apostles resulted in the spread of the gospel. And so there was this slogan in the early church: the blood of the saints is the seed of the church. The more the church was persecuted, the more the church grew. Just as in the arrest of the Apostle Paul, it allowed the gospel to be made known to the entire Praetorian Guard. Philippians 1:12. I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. So Christians, we need to remember that even when we lose, we actually win. Even when we fall forward. Now you say, well, what about all those times when the plotting of the evil have actually worked? Through scheming, evil people have gotten into the place of power. I mean, there were times in the past where men like James Comey, Strzok, and Page plotted to bring about political results, and it actually worked. Well, only in a short term. In the long term, everything always works against those with an ungodly agenda. Romans chapter 8, verse 28, we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. But for the ungodly, the reverse is true. All things work together for bad to those who hate God. So if God so chooses in the short term, he may give ungodly people some success, but it's only so that in the long term, God's people are better helped. Remember, Satan, even when he put Jesus on the cross, it appeared for a little while that he was winning. But in the long term, it was his defeat. Here's another recent political example. Back in 2013, when the Democrats controlled the Senate, Harry Reid ended the filibuster rule that required 60 votes to confirm a Supreme Court justice. And the Democrats were gloating that now they could put their nominees in without Republican obstruction. They didn't need a 60-vote majority. They could do it on 50 votes. And at that time, the Republican minority leader, Mitch McConnell, warned Reid that he would come to regret that move. And so it has come to pass. The ruling that was meant to help the left ends up helping the right. So now Republicans can put in conservative Supreme Court justices with just 50 votes. Now, the prime example of all this is the book of Esther. The entire book is dedicated to this one subject of God changing events meant to hurt the righteous and bring those events back on the heads of the wicked. Now, the book of Esther was written in a time when God's people were in exile, outside the theocracy of Israel, under the dominion of evil kings. And the story was written to encourage God's people and to remind them that God is still in control, that evil people are not thwarting the plan of God. In fact, everything they do against God's plan will actually help God's plan. And for a while, it did appear as if Haman won, and the Jews would be destroyed. But by the end of the story, Haman is hanging on the gallows that he built for Mordecai, the Jew. So, in the story, it just so happens that King Ahasuerus deposes his queen Vashti. Chapter 1, verse 19. So he goes out looking for a new queen. And it just so happens that Esther, a Jew, is chosen. Chapter 2, verse 16. And so Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to his royal palace. And it just so happened that her uncle Mordecai discovers a plot to kill the king and saves the king's life. Chapter 2, verse 22. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and this will be a factor later in the story. Haman the Agagite, was an official in the Persian Empire, and he hated Mordecai because it just so happens that Haman became aware that Mordecai would not bow down before him when he passed by. And Haman hated all of the Jews. And so he made up a law that specifically targeted the Jews for destruction, and he got the king to sign it under a false pretext. Esther chapter 3, verse 1, the king said to Haman, "The silver is yours, and the people also, to do with them as you please." So to thwart this new edict, Mordecai and Queen Esther set up a special banquet for herself, Haman, and the king. Haman, in his pride, thinks that the king is going to honor him. So he goes to all of his friends and his family and boasts about having this special private meeting with the king and the queen. And he then has a gallows built for Mordecai. Esther chapter 5, verse 11. Then Haman recounted to them the glory of his riches and the number of his sons, and every instance where the king had magnified him, and how he had promoted him above the princes and the servants of the king. Haman also said, "Even Esther the queen, let no one but me come with the king to a banquet which she had prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her with the king." Now it just so happens that that night the king cannot sleep. And so he has his scribes read to him from the Chronicles of the King. Apparently they were so boring that they would cure any insomnia. But in the reading of these chronicles to the king, they come to the place where Mordecai saved the king. The king realizes that Mordecai has never been rewarded. Chapter 6, verse 5, Haman happens to be in the court. The king asks Haman what should be done for the one the king seeks to honor. Haman thinks that the king is talking about him. He tells the king, well, if you want to honor somebody, dress him in royal robes and parade him through the city and proclaim to everyone that this is the man that the king wants to honor. Well, the king says to Haman, well, that's a great idea. I want you to do this for Mordecai. And Haman is completely humiliated, having to honor the very person that he was seeking to kill. That evening, there was the dinner with the king and the queen. And at the dinner, the queen tells the king that Haman has plotted to kill her people, the Jews. The king is enraged. He steps out of the room. Haman then pleads with Esther for his life, but he's over her on the couch, and the king walks back in. Esther chapter 7, verse 8. Now when the king returns from the palace garden into the place where they had been drinking wine, Haman was fallen on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, will he even assault the queen with me in the house? As the words went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And so the king has Haman hung on the gallows that Haman built for Mordecai. So the whole book is about how circumstances, planned and unplanned by man, work against the one who is trying to destroy the work and the people of God. Everything that Haman did actually set up his own destruction. And the unusual thing about the book of Esther is that the name of God is not mentioned once. And for this reason, some have doubted the canonicity of the book of Esther, because it doesn't even mention the name of God. But most scholars believe that that is a purposeful literary device to demonstrate that God is at work, although he is unseen and although he's unnamed. So this lesson in the story of Esther is not unique to this ancient event. We must realize that it's repeated continually every day in the history of this world. The book of Esther is not an isolated story. It is trying to teach us how God is continually working to thwart the plans of the wicked. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 30. There is no wisdom and no understanding and no counsel against the Lord. Proverbs 19:21. Many plans are in man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord will stand. Isaiah 14:27. For the Lord of hosts has planned, and who can frustrate it? And as for his stretched out hand, who can turn it back? Isaiah chapter 8, verse 10. Devise a plan, and it will be thwarted. State a proposal, but it will not stand, for God is with us. So you cannot win against God. Not only will you fail, but everything you do will actually help God. Now, this term, unintended consequences, it tends to be used in economic terms. Economists use it to describe how government policies often backfire because politicians do not consider or they do not know the consequences of their actions. Such as when you raise taxes, it reduces economic incentives, and so in the end you actually get less taxes. Or when you raise minimum wage, sometimes you get unemployment. And the reason, again, for the unintended consequences is because nobody is smart enough to predict or understand all of the causes and effects that happen in the world. Well, for those who are unsaved, those who are outside Christ's kingdom, their whole life becomes a life of unintended consequences. They hope for life, but because they sow to the flesh, they will reap what they do not expect: corruption. Psalm chapter 2 reminds us that the nations, the people, imagine a vain thing. They think that they can take their counsel against the Lord and against his anointed. They actually think that they can tear God's fetters apart and cast away his cords from them. But he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them, for he has installed his king on Mount Zion, the Lord Jesus Christ. Philippians chapter 2, verse 10. So at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow, of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and that every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So bow your knee today to Jesus Christ as your Lord, so that you will not have to someday bow your knee to Jesus Christ as your judge. Now some commentary on the culture. To the relief of conservatives, the Supreme Court ruled for the right in 3 cases. First, California law was overturned that forced pregnancy centers, crisis pregnancy centers, to provide materials promoting abortion. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled in NIFLA versus Becerra that a California law that requires crisis pregnancy centers to disseminate information on how to obtain abortions violates the First Amendment. So this is how much the left loves abortion. They believe citizens should be forced to promote it. The CNN's bias reporting on this was an article entitled, "The Supreme Court Just Enabled a Network to Deceive America's Women." The second court case, Trump's travel ban against certain countries that sponsor terrorism, was upheld. Quote, Supreme Court ruled Tuesday that President Trump has the authority to ban travelers from certain majority Muslim countries if he thinks it's necessary to protect the United States. A victory in what has been a priority since Trump's first weeks in office, and a major affirmation of presidential power. The vote was 5-4, with conservatives in the majority and the Chief Justice John Roberts finding that a string of unprecedented comments and warnings from Trump about Muslims did not erode the president's vast powers to control entry into this country. The third case, workers don't have to join and pay dues to public sector unions. Quote, the Supreme Court dealt a major blow to public sector unions on Wednesday in a case that could shake the financial structure and undermine their future stability. The Supreme Court may have just signaled the end of the union era of politics. The justices struck down an Illinois law that required non-union workers to pay fees that go to collective bargaining, and overturned a 1977 law that required employees to pay so-called fair share fees. So this is freedom of association, and this helps put an end to union monopolies. Now, each of these decisions were 5-4 because Donald Trump and the Republicans put Gorsuch on the Supreme Court. Imagine if Hillary had won the election. Those cases would have been lost, and that would have been a terrible overturning of fundamental American freedoms. Now, another piece of news this week was that Justice Kennedy is retiring from the Supreme Court at the end of July, and this gives Republicans another chance to put a conservative judge on the Supreme Court. The short list of nominees include very conservative, pro-life, pro-freedom judges, and the left is beside themselves because they have always used the courts as a way to move the country toward the left. Proverbs 21:15, the exercise of justice is joy for the righteous, but it's a terror to the workers of iniquity. 2 points in all this. First, these rulings don't fundamentally change our culture. This only slows down the moral decline legally. Let's remember that the real victories and the real way to change a culture is through grassroots evangelism and conversion. Secondly, although this is good news, I think we're entering into a new political climate where the left is beginning to ignore legal precedents and beginning to ignore higher court rulings. Just take, for example, the Arizona Appeals Court completely ignoring the Masterpiece Cake ruling and ruling against a Christian who refused to provide printed material for a homosexual wedding. And this is lawlessness. We're going to see more and more of it. A Christian culture obeys the law, even most laws that they disagree with. But a secular culture has no reason to obey law. So my prediction is that we're going to start seeing liberal lower courts and politicians ignore conservative case law, even Supreme Court rulings. And this is the left's civil disobedience. This is their resistance movement. Psalm 64:5. They hold fast to themselves an evil purpose. They talk of laying snares secretly. They say, who can see them? They devise injustice, saying, we are ready with a well-conceived plot, for the inward thoughts and the heart of man are deep. And the next major story in the news confirms this. Democratic harassment against people with conservative values. After losing pretty much the Russian investigation, losing these court rulings, losing the immigration battle, looks like the left is turning to harassment, violence, protests. The president's press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, goes out to a restaurant to eat with some family members, and the restaurant owner asks Sanders and her party to leave. And after the family goes to a restaurant across the street, these leftists follow them over there and continue the harassment. The Republican Attorney General of Florida, Pam Bondi, was at a movie, and a mob of people started screaming at her for her political positions. Kristen Nielsen, Secretary of Homeland Security, she was out to eat at a restaurant, and a mob of people began shouting at her. And what they were doing is not engaging in rational conversation. They were just shouting shame, 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 shouting obscenities, because they believe they have a moral imperative to disturb the peace of these people. Then Maxine Waters, Democratic Congresswoman from California, gives a speech calling for the harassment of Trump administrators. She says, if you see anybody from the cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, You get out and you create a crowd and you push back on them and you tell them that they're not welcome anymore anywhere. Now, there's a lot to be said about this. And as this movement grows, I'm probably going to have to do a whole program about it. But in short, this is not something that Christians would do. Not something that a Christian culture would do. Just consider the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. But the left's justification here for harassment is moral indignation, that the Republicans are so immoral that it calls for drastic measures. So think about this. The left is beginning to think that their positions on open border, abortion, LGBT behavior is so morally right. And they're beginning to think that the right's position against open borders and against abortion and against LGBT behavior is malevolent evil, that as they move toward the left, they are more calling good evil and evil good. For example, wouldn't you scream and protest if someone was raping a child? Well, this is how the left is depicting the moral positions or the moral actions of those on the right. They're depicting those on the right as being Nazis, as creating death camps. So the root problem here is moral confusion, resulting in the persecution of the righteous. And this is how God's people have always been persecuted, because the wicked become so depraved that they actually begin to believe that they're morally superior. And so they justify their violence on that behavior. This is what Jesus said in John chapter 16. They will make you outcasts from the synagogue, but an hour is coming for everyone who kills you to think that he's offering service to God. These things they will do because they have not known the Father or me. So this is all because they don't know God. And because they don't know God, they don't know his law. And so they ignore his law and they persecute his people. And so this is going to get worse. And I think we should expect Antifa to start to show up again, because whenever the left begins to call out for harassment and to call out for people to be shut down, Antifa shows up, Antifa, however you want to pronounce it. And also there's this growing movement to protest ICE offices. The left is actually calling for the elimination of ICE, the U.S. border security. And just like the Occupy Wall Street movement, there are people with deep pockets funding these sit-ins in front of ICE. Well, this is the world in all of its glory, paraded before everyone to see. This is the kingdom of man in rebellion to God. And let me close with one of my favorite verses, Acts chapter 2, verse 40. And with many other words, Peter solemnly testified and kept on exhorting them, saying, be saved from this perverse generation. So God is inviting us to leave the dominion of Satan and become citizens of the kingdom of Christ. So thank you for taking the time to make God and country a part of your discipleship in the Word. The contact information is on the closing slide. God bless you as you continue to walk in his Word.